Look, sometimes you mess up. That's okay. It's why we say that failure is feedback. But sometimes the feedback you get is that the action you took and the failure that resulted from it are degrading the trust on your team. And when that happens, it's not enough to just learn from your mistakes. You need to rebuild trust on that team. Hey leader, David Burke is here, organizational psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. And a large part of helping teams do their best work ever is building and cultivating trust on the team. You know, Google's famous Project Aristotle survey showed that the difference between high-performing teams and everybody else was basically explained by 5 factors, and paramount of those factors was a sense of psychological safety, a feeling of mutual trust and respect held on that team. And as we know from Paul Zach's research into how trust forms between humans, trust isn't given and trust isn't earned, it's reciprocated. On an ideal team, trust creates a virtuous cycle where team members begin to trust themselves and trust the leadership of that team more and more and more as the relationship with the team grows. But sometimes failures happen, sometimes you intentionally or unintentionally violate trust on that team. And when that happens, the virtuous cycle of trust can become a vicious cycle of degrading trust. And so you're going to have to act. You're going to have to make a clean break from the degradation of trust and begin to turn that cycle back around positive and rebuild trust on that team. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how you can get that process started, how you can rebuild trust when it's violated on your team. So the first step to rebuild trust on a team is to own the failure. Doesn't matter if it was actually your failure or not, right? Sometimes leaders act in certain ways, intentionally or not, that degrade trust on a team. They accidentally share with the whole team something that was shared with them in confidence, or they misread someone's facial expressions, or they don't get the nonverbal communication because a message is sent in an email and they respond extra sarcastically, or they just ignore what was actually a legitimate concern. There are a bunch of different things that can happen where a leader can violate trust. Sometimes it wasn't you that actually started that violation of trust, but maybe you let some misbehavior continue on for too long, or maybe you weren't clear enough about what levels of expectation of privacy or respect were happening on the team. There is almost always something for you as the leader to own, and when you own it, you demonstrate that you're serious about not letting this slide, and you're serious about realizing that this was a violation of trust and serious about correcting it. And that's why the very first step is to own that failure. Take responsibility for it, even if it doesn't look like yours. And your team will appreciate that you are serious and that you are owning that problem. The next step to rebuilding trust on a team is to understand the consequences. What are the consequences of that action? You know, the example we used prior, maybe you accidentally said something to the team that was a violation of somebody's assumed privacy. There are consequences to that, right? Because now there may be information that was in that message that degrades trust between members of the team, or it may be because that individual member of the team doesn't believe they can come to you in confidence anymore. That failure had a consequence. It will have downstream consequences if it's not addressed. And part of owning that actual failure and making amends for it is understanding the consequences of your action or the action that you allowed to happen and why those consequences are so dire that you are stepping in now. Part of what you communicate to the team is going to be this understanding of the consequences of your actions. And so before you jump into any meeting with individuals or your whole team, you need to do the work to understand the consequences so that you can speak to them. And speaking of those consequences, that brings us to the third step in rebuilding trust on a team, and that is to apologize. Full stop, apologize. You took ownership of the issue, you understand the consequences, you owe your team an apology. And what I mean when I say an apology here is not, I'm sorry if somebody misunderstood my intentions, or I'm sorry if it made you feel that way. Those aren't apologies, right? Those are attempts to let yourself off the hook and make the other person feel bad for being wronged. It's literal gaslighting. That's not an apology. An apology is, when I did this, that was wrong. And I understand that now. And I understand the consequences of that. And I want to say, I'm sorry for that behavior. In fact, one of the ways to know if you've given a sufficient enough apology to your team is if I'm sorry is a complete sentence with a period at the end. Not a comma, not a semicolon, not an em dash. I'm sorry, period. But it's also not enough to merely apologize, which brings us to the fourth step in rebuilding trust on a team, which is to outline the correction. In other words, you recognize that what you did was a failure and you're sorry. But what are you going to do about it moving forward? And when I say what are you going to do about it, this is twofold, right? So part of the correction is how you're making amends for the past wrong, right? What reparations are you trying to make in order to prove that you understand that you did some damage to trust there? But it's not just how am I making up for it in the past, it's also what am I going to do in the future to ensure it doesn't happen again. You need to outline both of those corrections when you apologize to your team or to that individual. You need to make sure that they know that you are truly sorry, that you are going to make the past failure right, but also that you are going to put in a system in place or a change of behavior or something you are going to do in the future that will keep that same wrong from happening again. And when you do that, to do that effectively, you're going to need some help. And that brings us to the fifth step in rebuilding trust on a team, which is to ask for help. Ask for help from your team. You recognized that this behavior that you did or that you allowed to happen was wrong. You understand the consequences of it. You're sorry for it and you're trying to make amends for it, but you're going to need help. Specifically, depending on the correction, you might need help with people pointing out when you are dangerously close to repeating the behavior. You might need help with people acting as an accountability partner for you in the future to make sure it's not happening again. You might need help in a variety of different ways, and it's appropriate to ask your team for help, right? Asking your team for help actually demonstrates a level of vulnerability as well, right? You've admitted failure, which is one level of vulnerability, but you're taking it to another level in saying that you can't necessarily do this alone. Asking for help is a great way to get your team involved in that, and that only happens when you're vulnerable. So that not only stops the vicious cycle of degradation of trust that happened when that initial failure was committed, but it gets the whole team involved in trying to reverse course and turn that back into a virtuous cycle of trust building. You can't do it alone. Now, this is going to take time, right? I mean, this is going to take time to prepare, to take ownership of it, understand the consequences. The apology itself is going to take time because you are going to need to make time to listen to others as they talk about the damage that your potential act did, and that's going to be really, really uncomfortable. But even when you get into the fifth and final step around asking for help, and even as you start to chart a new course where you're putting systems in place to prevent that failure from happening again, it's going to take time. Trust isn't given, trust isn't earned, it's reciprocated. And when someone makes a huge deposit from that bank of trust, it's going to take time to let those little small investments compound and get to a place where you were before that violation happened. And that means you need to be comfortable with the idea that certain people are going to take more time than others to get back to a place where they trust you again as well. In the end, when you get that virtuous cycle, that reciprocal cycle of trust moving again, you may actually take your team to a totally new level of trust because they've walked through that together. I can't promise you that, but if you put these 5 steps in action, if you mean it, and if you're serious about rebuilding trust in your team, you may end up building a stronger bond down the road if you're willing to be patient with it. A bond that helps everybody trust each other more, and a bond that helps everybody do their best work ever. Oh, and one more thing. When you're leading a virtual or hybrid or a remote team, while the principles of reciprocal trust don't change, some of the tactics do. So if you're in that situation, you're gonna wanna watch this video here on how to build trust on a remote team. Maybe even share the video on your next Zoom call. That video right there.